The grand gala was nothing short of spectacular, an ocean of glistening chandeliers, echoing laughter, and the clinking of fine crystal glasses. The room buzzed with an energy only the elite could understand, the whispers of high society fluttering through the air like the softest melodies. The who's who of the world were present, flaunting their wealth, influence, and, above all, respect. But amidst this grandeur, one person stood out. Or, rather, one person felt like they didn't belong. Xavier Musk, son of the legendary tech magnate Elon Musk, had always been out of place in spaces like this. Despite being raised in a world where his father's name was synonymous with innovation and the future, Xavier didn't feel the comfort that most would expect of someone so entrenched in privilege. On the contrary, he felt invisible in a crowd of people who judged him by his last name, never seeing the person behind it. He wasn't sure if anyone here knew him for anything other than the fact that he was Elon Musk's son, and tonight, it seemed like that was all anyone cared about. The buzz around him was subtle but palpable. The gala, a high-society event hosted by a group of elite philanthropists, was set to feature an evening of performances, musicians, dancers, and artists from all over the world. Xavier was slated to perform on stage, but that wasn't what had him nervous. What made his stomach turn in tight, uncomfortable knots was the fact that, even before he had played a single note, there were whispers. There were always whispers. His last name was his curse and his identity, and sometimes, it felt more like a prison than a privilege. "I heard he's got a piano piece prepared," one woman murmured to her companion. "I'm sure it's nothing special, though. You know how these rich kids are, they can buy their way into anything." Another voice chimed in, filled with disdain. "Oh, please. He's just here to rub elbows and show off. He'll probably butcher whatever piece he tries to play." Xavier winced. He wasn't new to this. From the moment he was old enough to understand what it meant to have a name like Musk, he knew the weight of other people's expectations. But tonight, something inside him snapped. Why was he defined by his last name and not his own abilities? As his nerves built up, he reminded himself that he wasn't just the son of Elon Musk. He was Xavier. And tonight, he was going to show the world that he was more than just a shadow of his father's success. Then, as if to punctuate his internal struggle, a sharp voice cut through the air, chilling him to his core. "Ah, here we go," Jonathan Blackwell said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The Prince of Silicon Valley, gracing us with his presence. Maybe he'll impress us with a few notes, though I doubt it. I've seen plenty of rich kids try their hand at art, and they always fall flat." The pianist, renowned for his scathing critiques, didn't seem to care that his words were directed at the son of one of the richest and most influential men in the world. He stood there, arms crossed, watching Xavier with a smirk plastered on his face as if waiting for a train wreck to unfold. Xavier's heart sank. His palms became clammy, and his throat tightened. He wanted to lash out, to tell Blackwell off, but he didn't. He had spent so much of his life trying to escape the role that others had assigned him. Maybe this was the moment that would change everything. Taking a deep breath, Xavier forced himself to focus. Focus on the music. Focus on the music. That's all that mattered now. The audience? The whispers? The mockery? None of that mattered. He was here for one reason, to play. And he would prove that he wasn't some privileged kid, some copy of his father's genius. He was Xavier Musk. And tonight, the world would see who he truly was. The moment came quicker than expected. A staff member signaled that it was his turn. He could feel the eyes of the room on him as he walked toward the grand piano set up in the center of the stage. The air felt thick with anticipation, but it was the kind of anticipation that had no faith in him. The audience had already written him off as another spoiled heir trying to live up to an impossible legacy. He could hear murmurs, some snickering, some whispers of curiosity, and others filled with polite indifference. Xavier sat down at the piano, trying to ignore the tension swirling in his chest. His hands trembled slightly as he positioned them over the keys. The spotlight on him felt like an enormous weight, pressing down on his shoulders. But he didn't let it stop him. In the audience, Jonathan Blackwell stood with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. He was already preparing himself for the disappointment, for the inevitable failure. But Xavier was no longer thinking about the expectations or the opinions of others. His fingers hovered over the keys, ready to make his move. He was playing for himself now. The first note echoed through the hall. Then another. And another. As Xavier began to play, something shifted. He wasn't the awkward kid who had been mocked in the lobby. He wasn't Elon Musk's son. He was just a musician, someone who could make sense of his world through music. The notes poured out, each one filled with raw emotion. He felt it in every finger, in every breath, in every moment. The music was an expression of his frustration, his hope, and his deep desire to be understood. The piece he had chosen, an intricate composition by Chopin, was known for its complexity. It was a risk, one that even seasoned pianists often found daunting. But for Xavier, it was perfect. It was bold. It was his statement. The audience, initially indifferent, began to quiet down. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others stopped whispering. Even Jonathan Blackwell, who had been so ready to pounce on Xavier's inevitable failure, now stood still, his gaze fixed on the piano. The melody swirled through the room, its complexity both beautiful and haunting. Xavier's heart raced, but he didn't stop. Each note he played felt like a revelation. The audience, once skeptical, began to feel the power of his performance. There was something real in his playing, something that no one could deny. As the music reached its climax, the tension in the room shifted. Xavier was no longer the mockery of the evening. He had taken control of his own story, and the crowd could do nothing but listen. When the last note was played, the hall fell into a stunned silence. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. Then, as if on cue, the audience erupted into applause. Xavier's heart pounded in his chest, not from nerves, but from the rush of validation. Not the kind that came from wealth or fame, but the kind that came from within. He had done it. Not for them. For him. Xavier stood up, his fingers still tingling from the keys. His eyes met Jonathan Blackwell's, and the smug expression the pianist had worn earlier was replaced with something else, something that might have been respect. But Xavier didn't care about that. He cared only about the music, the feeling, and the message he had sent. The crowd's applause continued, and as Xavier made his way off the stage, he couldn't help but feel a small smile tug at his lips. Tonight, he had played for himself. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Xavier Musk had never known a life free from expectations. Growing up in the sprawling, modern mansions that dotted the Californian landscape, he was surrounded by luxury that came with a constant, unspoken pressure. Elon Musk, his father, was a visionary, a man who seemed to rewrite the rules of business, space exploration, and even what it meant to be human. To the world, he was a hero, an eccentric genius who would change the future. To Xavier, he was simply Dad, but it had never felt simple. From a young age, Xavier was thrust into a world of extraordinary intellect and achievement, a world that valued innovation and success above all else. He remembered, with perfect clarity, being 5 years old and sitting in his father's office while Elon Musk spoke to engineers and scientists about revolutionizing the world. Every conversation was about Mars, electric cars, or the future of artificial intelligence. And while his father's mind soared through the stars, Xavier had always felt like his feet were firmly planted on Earth. And often, a bit too far from where he wanted to be. When he was young, Xavier tried his best to emulate his father's brilliance. He absorbed books like a sponge, devouring everything from history to science, and often tried to impress his father with his knowledge of complex concepts. But Elon didn't always have time for him. The man was busy, consumed by his empire-building endeavors, always thinking 2 steps ahead, while Xavier struggled to keep up. As a result, the relationship between father and son was strained. Xavier never felt as though he lived up to his father's lofty expectations. It wasn't because Elon wasn't a good parent, he was, in his own way, but it was more about the sheer magnitude of his success. Xavier never felt like he had a space to simply be. Instead, he was the son of a tech mogul, and people expected him to be a reflection of that legacy. But inside, Xavier wasn't sure who he was supposed to be outside of his father's shadow. His mother, Justine Musk, was a different story. Unlike Elon, Justine had always been there for him, guiding him through his childhood with warmth and affection. She was the one who took him to piano lessons, the one who sat through his performances at local recitals, always encouraging him to find his own voice in the world. In those moments, when they were alone in their living room, Xavier could imagine a future where he wasn't just the son of someone famous. He could see himself as an individual, with his own path to follow. But even with Justine's unwavering support, Xavier often felt torn. He could never quite reconcile the 2 sides of his life, the one that was shaped by the incredible legacy of his father, and the one that was quietly nurtured by his mother. The pressure to succeed, to match the achievements of Elon, was stifling, but it wasn't something Xavier could ever fully talk about. How could he? Who would understand? The world would expect him to succeed in the same way his father did, and yet, Xavier had no clear idea of how to do that, or even if he wanted to. School had always been a struggle. Not because he was incapable, but because the expectations placed upon him were suffocating. Teachers and classmates alike saw him through a lens of privilege. They saw the last name, Musk, and assumed he had everything he could ever want. But Xavier was different from the other rich kids. He wasn't interested in the parties, the constant stream of social events, or the shallow interactions that came with his family's wealth. His peers didn't know how to relate to him, and to be honest, he didn't know how to relate to them either. They couldn't fathom the complexity of his life, the pressure of being someone's child, yet trying to carve out a future of his own. As he grew older, Xavier began to find solace in smaller, quieter moments. Playing the piano, for example, gave him a sense of peace that nothing else could. It wasn't something he'd chosen because it was expected of him, it was something that had always been there, something he had done because he simply loved it. The piano gave him the space to explore emotions, to feel his pain and his joy without the constraints of the world around him. It allowed him to express himself in ways words couldn't. But even then, doubts crept in. Was he truly talented, or was this just another thing he had access to because of his family's resources? Was the applause he received after performances real, or were people just applauding the Musk name? He couldn't tell anymore. The external validation that he once craved had started to feel hollow. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the support, he did. It was just that he had begun to question whether it was for him or for the image of what people thought he should be. This internal conflict reached its peak on the night of the grand gala. Xavier knew he had to face it head-on. The gala wasn't just another event, it was the moment he had been preparing for. He wasn't going to walk on stage and simply play for others' approval. This time, it was about more than that. It was about finding a way to step out from the shadows of his father's accomplishments and find something that was his own. The conversation with his mother earlier in the day echoed in his mind. Xavier, Justine had said, you're not just the son of Elon Musk. You are your own person. You have your own dreams, your own passions. Don't let anyone tell you who you are or what you're capable of. He had taken her words to heart, but as he walked into that gala, with its glittering lights and cold, judgmental stares, he felt more uncertain than ever. Could he really do this? Could he stand up there and play, knowing that the world would be watching with preconceived notions about who he was? The whispers in the crowd had only reinforced his doubts. But there, on that stage, surrounded by the echoes of his father's legacy, Xavier realized something important: he didn't need to live up to anyone's expectations. He didn't need to be anything other than who he was. He was Xavier Musk, and that was enough. With this newfound clarity, Xavier was ready to face the challenge. He wasn't just going to play piano. He was going to prove to himself, and the world, that he was more than the sum of his family's legacy. It was his time to shine, not because of who his father was, but because of who he was choosing to become. As Xavier stepped off the stage, the applause was still ringing in his ears, but it didn't quite feel like the victory he had imagined. In fact, as he walked through the backstage hallway, his mind buzzed with a cocktail of emotions: pride, relief, but also a gnawing sense of unease. He had played for himself, and the crowd had responded, but something was off. Something in the back of his mind told him that this wasn't the end of his journey. Backstage, the buzz of conversation from the guests filtered through the walls, a reminder of the lives these people led, lives that never seemed to worry about something as trivial as self-doubt. Jonathan Blackwell's words still stung in Xavier's ears. The pianist's criticism had been like a sharp slap, filled with venom and mockery. For all the applause he had received, it was Blackwell's voice that kept echoing in his mind. "You'll probably butcher whatever piece you try to play." That's what Blackwell had said before Xavier's performance. Xavier had wanted to dismiss it, to push it aside as just another scornful remark from someone who didn't know him. But the truth was, it did bother him. After all, Blackwell wasn't just any pianist, he was a household name in the classical music world, a man whose approval could mean the difference between obscurity and a successful career. And tonight, Blackwell hadn't just criticized his playing, he had questioned his entire right to be there in the first place. Was it really just about the music? Xavier's thoughts began to spiral, as they always did when he felt the weight of his father's legacy bearing down on him. He had done what he thought was right, he had poured his heart and soul into his performance, hoping to make a statement that was his own. But the moment the applause stopped, Xavier found himself questioning everything. Was he really seen for who he was, or was he still just Elon Musk's son? Just as his thoughts deepened, he turned the corner and nearly collided with someone, a familiar figure standing in the shadows of the backstage area. It was Sophia Hale, his childhood friend, someone who had always been there to ground him when things seemed out of control. Sophia was a fellow musician, someone who understood Xavier on a level few others did. Unlike the people at this gala, Sophia didn't care about his last name, she cared about who he was as a person, and that was something Xavier had always appreciated about her. "Hey," she said, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "That was incredible, Xavier." Xavier couldn't help but let out a soft laugh, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, Sophia. But I don't know. I don't think it was enough." Sophia raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" Xavier sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I'll ever be enough for these people. No matter what I do, it feels like I'm always living in someone else's shadow." Sophia's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not living in anyone's shadow, Xavier. You just have to stop trying to prove something to everyone else. You did great out there. And anyone who has something negative to say isn't worth your time." Xavier met her gaze, his eyes darkened by the weight of his own self-doubt. "But it's hard not to care, you know. Especially when it feels like there's this constant pressure to be someone I'm not." Sophia smiled gently, shaking her head. "That's the problem. You're trying to be someone else instead of embracing who you are. Your music, the way you play, it's already proof enough of who you are. You don't have to live up to anyone's expectations. You're Xavier Musk, and that's enough." Her words should have been comforting, and in many ways, they were. But Xavier couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play here. The world wasn't kind to people who didn't fit neatly into the boxes it created. And as much as Sophia's words resonated with him, he knew the truth: the world would always want him to be something. And that something wasn't just Xavier Musk. Later that night, as the gala came to an end and the guests began to filter out, Xavier found himself once again standing alone in a corner, watching as the high society mingled and celebrated. He should have been thrilled, basking in the afterglow of his performance. But instead, he felt a sense of emptiness that lingered, settling heavily on his chest. It was then that he spotted Jonathan Blackwell across the room, surrounded by admirers, his smug expression still in place. Xavier's stomach turned. Was Blackwell right? Was he nothing more than a privileged kid trying to impress people who didn't care about him? But something inside him snapped. He had to stop thinking like this. He had to stop letting these voices, these expectations, dictate his every move. Without thinking, Xavier walked toward Blackwell, his steps firm and deliberate. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, his mind racing. This was it. This was the moment he had been avoiding, the moment when he had to confront the doubts that had been festering inside him for so long. Jonathan noticed him approaching and raised an eyebrow. Ah, the musical prodigy himself. I didn't expect you to come over here. Xavier didn't waste time with pleasantries. You were wrong about me, he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. I don't need your approval. I'm not here to meet anyone's expectations. Not yours, not anyone else's. Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading slightly. And what makes you think you can just walk in here, uninvited, and demand respect? You're nothing but a trust fund kid playing at being a pianist. Xavier's fists clenched, but he held his ground. I'm more than just a name. I've worked hard for everything I've accomplished. And whether you like it or not, I'm not going anywhere. This is who I am. Take it or leave it. For a moment, there was silence between them. Jonathan's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a recognition that perhaps, just maybe, Xavier wasn't the naive, privileged kid he had assumed. Xavier stood there for a beat longer, letting the words hang in the air. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and walked away, feeling a rush of liberation that was both surprising and exhilarating. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Xavier took a deep breath, the weight of his confrontation with Jonathan settling in. This was only the beginning. The conflict had only just started to unfold, and Xavier knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But it was his road, and that was something no one could take away from him. The whispers, the judgment, the doubt, it would all follow him. But for the first time in a long time, Xavier felt ready to face it. The weeks following the gala felt like a whirlwind, as Xavier tried to push through the noise, continuing with his studies, practice sessions, and interactions with people who were only too happy to judge him. He had made his decision, he was going to forge his own path, even if it meant stepping away from the expectations everyone seemed to have placed on him. The clash with Jonathan Blackwell had been a defining moment, but Xavier knew that the road to proving himself wasn't going to be easy. And yet, despite his resolve, he felt a deep uncertainty creeping in. Was he really ready to leave behind the legacy of his father? Could he make it on his own? In a way, the conflict inside Xavier was just beginning. The weight of his father's shadow was something he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. Every time he picked up the piano keys, he heard the voices of critics and doubters. Every time he attended an event or interacted with someone in the industry, he couldn't shake the feeling that people were judging him based on his last name. But what could he do? How could he prove to the world that he wasn't just a Musk, but an individual in his own right? He began spending more time at the family's private estate, retreating from the public eye as he tried to regroup. He needed to rediscover himself, to find something that was truly his. That's when he came across an old piano, tucked away in a quiet corner of the estate, a piano that had been largely forgotten, a relic from his mother's earlier years as a musician. The moment Xavier's fingers touched the keys, something shifted inside him. It wasn't the pressure of a performance or the glaring eyes of critics, this was just him and the music. He let himself get lost in the sound, playing with a freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since that fateful night at the gala, he felt at peace with himself. But this peace was fleeting. His father's voice, demanding and commanding, echoed in the back of his mind, as if reminding him that time was running out to prove his worth. Elon Musk had never been one to leave anything to chance. Every move he made was calculated, driven by a thirst for innovation and progress. And Xavier felt that pressure acutely. One afternoon, while Xavier was playing, his mother walked in quietly, taking a seat in the corner of the room. He hadn't noticed her presence until she spoke. "You've been spending a lot of time here," she said, her voice gentle but laced with concern. "Are you okay, Xavier?" Xavier paused mid-song, unsure of how to answer. "I think so. I'm just trying to figure things out, you know. The music, the expectations, it's all just so overwhelming." Justine's gaze softened, and she walked over to him, sitting next to him at the piano. "You're not alone in this. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Your father and I both know what it's like to have the world look at you and see only what they want to see." Xavier looked at her, his eyes heavy with unspoken words. "But what if I'm not enough, Mom? What if I can't do this on my own?" His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "You are enough, Xavier. Not because of who your father is, but because of who you are. You have a gift, one that doesn't need to be measured against anyone else's. You just need to trust yourself." Xavier took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his mother's words. He had always known she believed in him, but her faith in him at this moment felt like a lifeline. He wasn't just the son of Elon Musk, he was his own person, with his own dreams, his own music, and his own path to follow. The next few weeks became a period of intense self-reflection for Xavier. He spent hours at the piano, experimenting with new compositions, and venturing into new genres of music. He no longer cared about what anyone else thought. The opinions of critics, of family friends, even of Jonathan Blackwell, they all faded into the background as he began to focus solely on what he loved. But the breakthrough came when he received an unexpected invitation. A prestigious music school in Vienna had heard about his performance at the gala and was interested in offering him a scholarship. They wanted him to join their program, with the opportunity to train with some of the finest musicians in the world. It was a dream come true. But at the same time, it presented a dilemma. Moving to Vienna meant leaving everything behind, the family, the legacy, the pressure to be something he wasn't. For days, Xavier wrestled with the decision. On one hand, the scholarship was a chance to be among the best, to develop his craft in an environment that celebrated music without the shadows of expectations. But on the other hand, it meant leaving behind the life he had known, with all its comforts and familiar faces. One evening, he sat with his mother, discussing the decision. "I think this is it, Mom," he said, his voice uncertain but filled with a sense of possibility. "This could be the opportunity I've been waiting for. But I don't know if I'm ready to leave everything behind." Justine smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "Xavier, you don't need to be ready. You don't have to have all the answers right now. What matters is that you're following your heart. If you want to go to Vienna, go. If you want to stay and make a difference here, stay. But whatever you choose, know that we'll support you." Xavier took a long, thoughtful breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. In that moment, he realized something profound: he didn't have to be defined by the expectations of others. Whether he stayed or left, his journey was his own to make. It was time for him to stop trying to measure up and start living authentically. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Xavier made his decision. He was going to follow the path that felt right to him, even if it meant taking risks and facing uncertainty. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. After all, the road to self-discovery was never easy, but it was the only road worth taking. The next day, Xavier accepted the scholarship to Vienna, knowing full well that his journey was just beginning. The days leading up to Xavier's departure to Vienna were a blur of emotions. There were goodbyes to be said, last-minute preparations to be made, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty that accompanied every step he took. For the first time in his life, Xavier wasn't just walking into the unknown, he was leaping into it. Sophia, his closest friend and confidant, had stayed by his side through the whole process. She had been his sounding board, the one person who understood the quiet moments of doubt that no one else could see. She came to visit him the night before his flight, bringing with her a small suitcase filled with things Xavier never thought he'd need but would come to cherish, some of his favorite books, a set of headphones, and a playlist of songs she knew would inspire him when the days felt lonely. "It's going to be okay, Xav," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed as he packed. "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something incredible." Xavier smiled faintly. "I know. It's hard, you know. I've spent my whole life feeling like I had to live up to some impossible standard. But now, I'm going to have to start from scratch. In a completely new world." Sophia nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "That's the point, though. You are starting from scratch. But that's the most exciting part. You're going to find out who you really are, Xav. Not just the guy people think you are. You're going to build something that's truly yours." Xavier's throat tightened at the weight of her words. He wasn't just leaving his home or his family behind, he was leaving behind a version of himself that had been built on other people's expectations. He didn't know if he was ready for the challenges ahead, but he knew one thing for sure: this was the only path that would lead him to the freedom he sought. The morning of his departure arrived too soon. The family gathered at the airport to say their goodbyes. His mother was as calm as ever, but there was a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. His father, though present, was distant, his usual intensity replaced with something softer, almost wistful. "Make us proud, Xavier," Elon said, clapping him on the back in his typical fashion. But Xavier could see that his father was struggling with something deeper, an unspoken worry that hovered in the air. Sophia gave him a tight hug before he boarded the plane, whispering, "You've got this, Xav. Don't forget why you're doing this. It's for you." As the plane ascended into the sky, Xavier looked out the window at the sprawling landscape below, the city fading into the distance. He had left behind a life of certainty for one that was completely unknown. The idea of starting over was both terrifying and exhilarating. But there was something else, too, something that made him feel a sense of peace. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was in control of his own destiny. Upon arriving in Vienna, Xavier was thrown into the deep end. The city was a world away from the Silicon Valley he had grown up in, its culture, its pace, its people. The music school was everything he had hoped for and more. The instructors were world-renowned, and the other students were some of the most talented musicians Xavier had ever met. For the first time, he was surrounded by people who were there for the music, not because of who his father was. Xavier threw himself into his studies. The rigorous schedule pushed him to his limits. There were moments when he doubted his abilities, when he felt overwhelmed by the talent surrounding him. But each time he struggled, he reminded himself of the decision he had made, to be true to himself, to trust the path he had chosen. One day, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Xavier found himself alone in one of the practice rooms. His hands were stiff from hours of playing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't quite reached his potential. The music felt like it was still just beyond his grasp. That's when he remembered the advice Sophia had given him: trust yourself. Xavier closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play, not a piece he had learned for the school, but one he had composed himself. It was raw, emotional, a reflection of his journey up to this point. As his fingers moved over the keys, he poured everything into the music, the uncertainty, the pain, the freedom. For the first time, Xavier didn't care if it was perfect. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was playing for himself, and that felt better than any applause he had ever received. But just as the final note rang out, the door to the practice room opened, and in walked his mentor, Professor George Schwartz, the head of the music school. Xavier froze, unsure of what to expect. Professor Schwartz listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Xavier finished, he paused for a moment, then spoke. That was extraordinary. Xavier's heart raced. Really? I mean, it wasn't polished, and Polished? Professor Schwartz interrupted. You don't need polish. What you need is honesty. Emotion. And you found that. Xavier stood there, stunned, unsure how to process what he had just heard. I don't know what to say. I've spent so long trying to fit into a mold, trying to live up to everyone's expectations. But when I play like that, I feel free. Professor Schwartz smiled. That's the secret of great music, Xavier. It's not about following rules or impressing people. It's about being true to yourself. And what you just played, that was you. Don't forget that. In that moment, everything clicked for Xavier. The path ahead was still uncertain, the challenges still daunting. But for the first time, he knew who he was. He was a musician. Not just because of his name, not because of his legacy, but because of his own voice, his own journey. The emotional climax wasn't a single moment of triumph, it was a realization. Xavier had finally found the courage to be himself, to trust his music, and to believe that his worth wasn't defined by anyone's expectations. It wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. And in that honesty, he had found his true voice. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Xavier stood by the window of his small apartment in Vienna, watching the early morning fog drift lazily over the city. It was a world away from the fast-paced life he had left behind in California. The sounds of the bustling city below felt muffled, almost dreamlike, as he found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him here. Months had passed since that pivotal moment in the practice room when Professor Schwartz had spoken those words to him, it's about being true to yourself. Xavier had returned to that advice time and time again, especially in moments of doubt. Those words had become the foundation of his transformation, his belief in himself, his music, and his future. The past few weeks had been a blur of growth and challenges. Xavier had learned to lean into the discomfort, embracing his flaws as part of the artistic process. No longer was he just the son of Elon Musk, a figure under constant scrutiny, he had become Xavier, the musician. The composer. The creator of his own future. It wasn't always easy. There were still times when he felt the weight of his past trying to pull him back. When he would walk into a room and feel eyes on him, sizing him up, expecting him to be something he wasn't. But instead of retreating, Xavier had learned to hold his ground, to step into the light and show the world who he truly was. One evening, after a particularly intense performance of a new piece he had composed for the school's winter recital, Xavier sat down at the piano in his practice room, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace. His hands moved over the keys, no longer seeking perfection, but simply creating for the sake of creation. His mind wasn't consumed by worry over what others thought of him or the legacy he had inherited. He wasn't trying to prove anything, he was just playing, and in that moment, he realized that was enough. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Xavier looked up to find Professor Schwartz standing in the doorway, his arms crossed. "Mind if I come in?" the professor asked. "Of course, Professor," Xavier replied, standing and gesturing to the piano bench beside him. "What's up?" Professor Schwartz walked in and took a seat. He observed Xavier for a moment before speaking. "I've been meaning to speak with you. There's something different about you lately. Something I can't quite put my finger on, but it's in your music." Xavier shifted uncomfortably. "I'm still figuring things out. I've always struggled with finding my own voice, but I think I'm getting there." Slowly. Professor Schwartz nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than that, Xavier. It's confidence. You've stopped worrying about what everyone else thinks, and it's reflected in your work. You found your own voice, and that's something rare." Xavier swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. The validation he had received from his mentor wasn't about being recognized as talented, it was about being seen. For the first time, he felt like someone truly understood the journey he had been on, the struggles he had faced, and the person he had become. But the conversation didn't end there. Professor Schwartz leaned forward, his tone becoming more serious. "I've been in the industry long enough to know when someone has the potential to be truly great," the professor said. "And you, Xavier, you've got that potential. It's up to you now to take it to the next level." Xavier's heart raced. He had been waiting for this moment, hoping for this kind of recognition, but it still felt surreal to hear it spoken aloud. "What do you mean? What's the next level?" Professor Schwartz smiled. "There's a concert coming up in the spring, a big one. It's a chance for a select group of students to perform at the famed Vienna Concert Hall. I'd like you to be a part of it. But it's not just about the performance, Xavier. It's about making a statement. About showing the world that you're more than just a name. That you're a force in your own right." Xavier's mind raced. The Vienna Concert Hall. The opportunity was incredible, but it also terrified him. Could he really stand on such a stage, in front of an audience, knowing that his father's name would cast a long shadow over him? But then, as he thought about everything he had been through, his struggles, his growth, his determination to find himself, he realized something. This was his chance. Not to prove himself to anyone else, but to himself. To show the world that he was no longer just the son of Elon Musk. He was Xavier, the composer, the musician, the person he had fought so hard to become. "I'll do it," Xavier said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "I'll take the stage." Professor Schwartz gave him a knowing smile. "I knew you would. And I believe this will be your defining moment." As the weeks passed, Xavier threw himself into preparation for the concert. He worked tirelessly on his piece, pushing himself to new heights. He no longer worried about whether he was good enough. He had accepted that perfection was not the goal. Authenticity was. And in his music, he finally felt like he was being true to himself. The day of the concert arrived faster than Xavier had anticipated. Standing backstage in the wings of the concert hall, his heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the moment was heavy, but this time, instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt ready. When the curtain finally rose, and Xavier walked onto the stage, the bright lights hit him, blinding him for a moment. The sea of faces in the audience felt distant, and yet, at that moment, it didn't matter. It wasn't about them. It was about the music. He sat at the grand piano, closed his eyes, and let his fingers move over the keys. The first notes were shaky, unsure, but then, as the melody unfolded, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. His music filled the hall, not with the sound of a son trying to prove himself, but with the sound of someone who had finally found his voice. When the final note lingered in the air, the audience was silent for a brief moment before erupting into applause. But Xavier didn't need their applause. What mattered was that, in that moment, he had finally become the musician he had always wanted to be. He wasn't defined by his last name, or the expectations of others. He was defined by his music. As the applause continued, Xavier stood, bowing to the crowd, but in his heart, he was already far beyond the performance. He had found what he had been searching for all along, himself. In the weeks that followed the performance at the Vienna Concert Hall, Xavier found himself living in a strange limbo. The initial euphoria of having completed such a monumental performance faded, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. The music still echoed in his mind, but the world around him seemed to have returned to its usual rhythm, until one afternoon, when everything changed. Xavier had just returned from a rehearsal when he received an unexpected phone call. He didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the other end sent a wave of surprise through him. "Xavier Musk," the voice said, smooth and authoritative. "This is Julia Scott from the New York Times." Xavier blinked. The New York Times? What could they possibly want with him? Yes, he answered, his voice uncertain. I was in the audience at your performance at the Vienna Concert Hall, Julia continued. And I have to say, it was one of the most moving performances I've seen in years. I'd love to do a feature on you, your journey, your music, and the way you've emerged from your father's shadow. Xavier felt a lump form in his throat. A feature? In the New York Times? The idea was both exciting and daunting. I don't know what to say, he replied honestly. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm the right person for such an article. I'm just starting out. Julia's voice softened, as if sensing his uncertainty. Xavier, that's exactly why I want to write about you. You're not just starting out, you've already done something incredible. You've overcome so much to get to where you are now. Your music, your journey, it's a story worth telling. There was a pause on the line, and Xavier could hear the distant hum of Vienna in the background. His mind raced. He had worked so hard to carve out a space for himself in the music world, but now, with the attention of a major publication, the fear of being defined by his father's legacy loomed larger than ever. But then he thought back to that moment in the practice room, when he had played for the first time without fear of judgment. The professor's words echoed in his mind again, it's about being true to yourself. Xavier exhaled slowly, letting go of his doubts. All right, he said, a newfound confidence in his voice. I'll do the interview. Julia's voice brightened with a note of excitement. Fantastic. I'll arrange a time for us to meet. I can't wait to learn more about your story. After hanging up the phone, Xavier sat quietly for a moment, letting the gravity of the conversation sink in. It was one thing to have the recognition of his peers and mentors, it was another entirely for someone like the New York Times to take an interest in him. This wasn't just about his music anymore. It was about the story he had to tell, the journey he had taken, the person he had become. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind his name, behind the pressure of being Elon Musk's son. Now, people were starting to see him for who he was, Xavier, not the shadow of his father. And in that moment, he realized something powerful, he had control over his own story. He could define his narrative. When the day of the interview arrived, Xavier found himself at a small cafe in the heart of Vienna, nervously waiting for Julia. It was a sunny afternoon, and the city felt alive with energy. He had chosen the spot because it was far from the usual distractions of the concert halls and the music school, a place where he could be himself, not just the performer. Julia arrived promptly, her presence calm but commanding. She was in her mid-30s, with short, dark hair and a keen, focused expression. She immediately put Xavier at ease with a warm handshake and a genuine smile. I'm so glad we could meet, Julia said as she sat down across from him. Your performance at the concert hall really left an impression on me. It's rare to see someone so young with such an authentic presence. Xavier nodded, grateful for her kind words but unsure of how to proceed. I wasn't really expecting any attention like this. I'm just trying to make my way in the world of music. That's exactly what I find fascinating, Julia said, taking out her notebook. So many people in your position would just lean into their family's legacy, let it define them. But you're clearly forging your own path. Tell me about that. What made you decide to pursue music in your own way? Xavier thought about the question for a moment, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of his coffee cup. I've always loved music, even when I was young. But for the longest time, I didn't know if I could ever really make it as a musician. My family's name always seemed to overshadow everything I did. And there was this constant pressure to be more successful, more visible. But eventually, I realized that it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about doing something I loved, something that was truly mine. Julia smiled, nodding in understanding. That's a powerful realization. And I think it's what sets you apart. So many people are focused on who they're supposed to be, but you've chosen to focus on who you actually are. Xavier felt a wave of relief wash over him. For once, He wasn't being defined by his family name or the expectations others had of him. He was finally able to speak candidly about his struggles and triumphs. As the interview continued, Xavier shared the story of his journey, his decision to leave behind Silicon Valley and study music in Vienna, the doubts and struggles he had faced along the way, and the moments of clarity that had changed him. He spoke about his passion for composition, his commitment to creating music that was raw and real, not just for the applause but for his own soul. When the interview wrapped up, Julia thanked him for his time and told him she was excited to share his story with the world. As Xavier walked back to his apartment that evening, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Not because of the recognition, but because he had finally embraced his truth. The world was starting to see him for who he was, and that felt like the greatest victory of all. That night, as he sat at the piano, Xavier played once again, not for anyone else, but for himself. He was no longer chasing after the approval of others. He had found his place in the world, and it was one that was entirely his own. And for the first time in his life, Xavier Musk didn't need to prove anything. His music would speak for itself. The article about Xavier's performance in Vienna came out in the New York Times just days after his interview with Julia. When Xavier first saw it online, his heart skipped a beat. The headline read, "Xavier Musk, breaking free from the shadow of Silicon Valley to find his own voice in music." As he scrolled through the article, he saw a picture of himself on stage at the concert hall, eyes closed, fingers poised above the piano keys in perfect concentration. The accompanying text painted a portrait of a young man who had fought against expectations and self-doubt to find his own identity in a world that had always tried to define him. It was the story he had always wanted to tell, but had never known how to put into words. Now, there it was, captured in black and white for the world to see. The response was overwhelming. His phone buzzed constantly with texts and emails. There were messages of congratulations from people he hadn't heard from in years. Former classmates, distant relatives, even family friends who had been watching from afar. And, of course, there were the people who had always expected greatness from him, despite his reluctance to live up to the family name. But the most gratifying messages came from musicians, young composers, pianists, and aspiring performers who reached out to say that his story had inspired them to keep going in their own journeys. Despite the flood of attention, Xavier couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vulnerability. For so long, he had avoided the spotlight. His father's fame had always made him feel like an extension of something much bigger than himself, a pawn in a story that wasn't his own. But now, he was being thrust into the limelight not as the son of Elon Musk, but as a musician in his own right. And, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Xavier spent the next few days wrestling with the conflicting emotions inside him. There was the pride that came with seeing his name in print, knowing that his hard work and dedication had been acknowledged. There was also the uncertainty, the fear that people would always look at him and see only the shadow of his father, no matter how hard he tried to break free. But as the days passed, and he read more and more messages of support, he realized something important: it wasn't about the spotlight. It was about the music. And if that music had the power to touch people and inspire them, then he was willing to stand in the light, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. One afternoon, Xavier was walking through a park near his apartment when he got another call. This time, it was from a prestigious music festival in Salzburg. They had read the article and wanted to extend an invitation for him to perform in their upcoming festival, a high honor in the classical music world. At first, Xavier thought he had misheard her. "You want me to perform?" he asked incredulously. "Yes, we'd love for you to join us. Your performance in Vienna was exceptional, and we believe your unique story and style would be a great fit for the festival. It's a huge opportunity for you." The offer was more than Xavier had ever imagined. He had heard about the festival in Salzburg for years, knowing it was a place where the world's most renowned musicians gathered. This was the kind of stage that could launch a career to unimaginable heights. But as he stood in the park, holding his phone, Xavier felt the familiar tug of hesitation. The pressure to succeed, the fear of living up to others' expectations, all of it threatened to overwhelm him. It was one thing to play in a small concert hall in Vienna, surrounded by familiar faces. But Salzburg? That was a different level entirely. Yet, as he thought back to the lessons he had learned over the past few months, about pushing through fear, about finding his own voice, Xavier knew what he had to do. He had to accept the invitation. Not because it was expected of him, but because it was the next step in his journey. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you." The festival organizers were thrilled, and soon Xavier found himself preparing for the performance of a lifetime. The pressure was mounting, and his anxiety began to creep in. He spent hours in practice, refining every note, making sure that each phrase in his composition conveyed the emotions he had worked so hard to express. As the date of the festival neared, Xavier couldn't shake the nervous excitement that built in him. He was still fighting the shadow of his father, still struggling to fully embrace the spotlight. But this time, he was doing it on his own terms. He wasn't a son trying to live up to his family's legacy. He was Xavier, the musician, the artist, the composer. And this performance was his chance to prove that to himself, once and for all. The day of the performance arrived, and Xavier stood backstage in Salzburg's Grand Concert Hall, heart racing. The vast space before him seemed intimidating, but as he took a deep breath, he realized something. He had already made it this far, not by clinging to his father's name or trying to meet other people's expectations, but by being true to who he was. As the curtain rose, he stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding him momentarily. The audience was a sea of faces, but Xavier didn't feel the usual rush of fear. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace. He sat at the grand piano, placed his fingers on the keys, and closed his eyes. The first few notes echoed through the hall, warm and resonant. And in that moment, he knew that this was exactly where he was meant to be. The music flowed from him effortlessly, each note a reflection of his growth, his struggles, and his journey. As the final notes of his composition lingered in the air, the crowd erupted in applause. Xavier stood, bowing with a humble smile. But inside, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was his moment. His story. His music. And in that moment, he understood that the spotlight, no matter how bright, was not something to fear. It was a reflection of everything he had overcome. And it was his to share with the world. Xavier's performance at the Salzburg Festival became a turning point in his career, but with newfound recognition came new challenges. As his profile rose, so did the weight of expectations. The applause and accolades had been exhilarating, but soon, they felt like a distant echo, replaced by the quiet hum of uncertainty that had crept back into his mind. Though he had proven his talent and individuality, Xavier couldn't ignore the whispers around him. There were conversations in the music world about how he was the son of Elon Musk, a name synonymous with innovation, revolution, and, to some, unreachable greatness. It was almost as if people couldn't separate Xavier from his father, no matter how much he had tried to carve out his own identity. Every success he achieved seemed to come with a follow-up question: how does it feel to be the son of someone so famous? Even in the music community, where artistry was meant to speak louder than any last name, people's perceptions of him were still tied to his father. Some admired him for overcoming the pressure of living in such a giant shadow, while others seemed to doubt whether his success was truly his own. One evening, as Xavier sat at a local café, scrolling through a review of his Salzburg performance, his phone buzzed again. It was another message, this time from an unknown number. Curious, he opened it. "You're doing well, Xavier. But how much of this is truly you, and how much of it is your father's influence? Don't get lost in the spotlight. You'll never escape the shadow of a legacy like his." Xavier's heart sank as he read the message. It wasn't the first time someone had made such an insinuation, but it was the first time someone had put it so bluntly. The message struck a nerve, dredging up insecurities he thought he had long buried. The more he thought about it, the more the question gnawed at him: was his success truly his own? Was it possible to escape the shadow of such an iconic figure, or was he destined to be forever seen through the lens of his father's legacy? For the first time in months, Xavier felt like he was losing control over his own narrative. No matter how many performances he gave, no matter how many times he composed music that was deeply personal to him, people continued to see him as a symbol rather than a person. As he walked back to his apartment that evening, Xavier's mind raced. He wasn't just grappling with the expectations of the public, he was facing the pressure of his own inner conflict. He had worked tirelessly to be more than just Elon Musk's son, but now he found himself wondering if that's exactly how everyone would always see him. That night, Xavier couldn't sleep. The weight of the question continued to loom over him: how much of me is truly me? The next day, Xavier made an unexpected decision. He called his father. Elon Musk was rarely one to entertain long conversations, preferring to focus on his ventures, but when Xavier explained the situation, Elon's tone shifted from curt to unexpectedly understanding. "I know what you're going through," Elon said after a moment of silence. "People have a tendency to judge you based on who they think you should be, not who you actually are. But let me tell you something, nobody gets to define you except you. The world may see you as my son, but only you can decide what that means." Xavier was silent, listening closely. "But, how do I keep people from seeing me that way?" "You can't. People will always see what they want to see. What matters is what you see in yourself. And if you're happy with who you are, what anyone else thinks doesn't matter." Xavier nodded, though he still wasn't entirely convinced. It wasn't as simple as just ignoring what people thought. The pressure still weighed heavily on him. But his father's words gave him a small sense of comfort, a reminder that he could take ownership of his own story. Later that day, Xavier went to the piano to compose. The keys, once again, became his refuge. He poured his thoughts and emotions into the piece, letting the music carry his worries away, at least for the moment. His fingers danced over the keys, creating something entirely his own, something that had nothing to do with his family name, or the expectations placed upon him. As the melody took shape, something inside Xavier clicked. This wasn't about escaping his father's shadow, it was about embracing who he was and accepting that his journey would never be like anyone else's. The world might see him as the son of Elon Musk, but that didn't define him. His music was his own. His story was his own. And in that moment, Xavier realized that he had been searching for approval from everyone except the one person who mattered most, himself. With renewed clarity, Xavier felt the familiar sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't about running from the expectations or trying to prove himself to others. It was about being true to who he was and letting the world see that. And with that realization came a sense of freedom he hadn't known he was missing. As the weeks passed, Xavier began to embrace the attention that came with his success, not as a burden, but as an opportunity. He learned to channel the pressure into something productive, using it to fuel his passion for music, rather than letting it drag him down. He performed in more prestigious venues, composed more original works, and continued to grow as an artist. Though the shadow of his father's legacy would always be there, Xavier was no longer afraid of it. Instead, he saw it for what it was, a part of his story, but not the whole of it. He was carving out his own path, and that was enough. One evening, after a particularly intense rehearsal, Xavier stood in front of a large mirror in the studio, looking at his reflection. He wasn't just the son of Elon Musk. He was Xavier Musk, a musician with a passion for his craft, a man on a journey of his own making. And that, he realized, was all he ever needed to be. The sound of the piano filled the studio with warmth and rhythm, but for Xavier, something had shifted. No longer was he playing in the shadow of his past or wrestling with the weight of other people's expectations. The music was no longer a vehicle for proving himself, it was an expression of freedom, an invitation to explore new parts of his soul. With every chord, he was rediscovering who he was, not just as a musician, but as a person. Over the next few months, Xavier's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. Invitations to perform came more frequently, and his music gained more traction in the classical world. Critics hailed him as a rising star, but it was the responses from his audience that truly mattered. People were moved by his vulnerability, his rawness, and the authenticity that poured from his compositions. They weren't just hearing notes, they were hearing his journey. But there was one performance that would change everything. Xavier received an email from an agent representing the prestigious Carnegie Hall in New York City. The subject line read, "A dream come true, invitation to perform at Carnegie Hall." As he opened the email, Xavier's heart raced. He had heard stories about this legendary venue since childhood. To play there was a dream come true for any musician. And now, it seemed, it was becoming a reality. The email stated that they had been following his work closely, and after seeing his performances in Salzburg and Vienna, they wanted him to headline a concert in their upcoming season. It was an offer most musicians only dared to dream of, and for Xavier, it felt like the culmination of years of struggle, self-doubt, and hard work. But as he stared at the email, the familiar question crept in once again: was this my achievement, or was it because of who I am? He had long moved beyond his father's legacy, but Carnegie Hall, with its history and its legacy of its own, was undeniably a part of that world. He couldn't help but wonder if people would see him as just another high-profile name in a long line of famous figures performing there. For days, Xavier went back and forth, unsure whether to accept the offer. He sought advice from his close friends, from Julia, and even from his father. Each conversation brought him back to the same point: this was an opportunity to continue growing as an artist. It wasn't about running away from expectations, but about stepping into them with pride, knowing that he had earned his place. Finally, after days of deliberation, Xavier made the decision. He would accept the invitation. This performance was his, and he would take ownership of it. The weeks leading up to the Carnegie Hall concert were a whirlwind of preparation. Xavier poured everything he had into rehearsals, fine-tuning his music and preparing the set list. His manager worked tirelessly behind the scenes, handling logistics and ensuring that everything went smoothly. It felt surreal: he was about to perform on one of the most famous stages in the world. But for Xavier, the real work wasn't just in the practice room. It was about confronting the last of his doubts. The night before the performance, Xavier stood in front of his mirror again, this time wearing his concert attire. He took a deep breath and looked at his reflection. "Are you ready?" he whispered to himself. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to fall away. He wasn't just preparing to play music, he was preparing to be himself, unapologetically. He wasn't the son of Elon Musk. He was Xavier, a man who had fought through his fears, his insecurities, and his past to get to this point. The music wasn't for anyone else. It was for him. As the day of the performance arrived, Xavier found himself feeling a strange mix of calm and excitement. He had gone through countless performances before, but this was different. It felt like the final test, the ultimate moment where he would prove not to anyone else, but to himself, that he was capable of standing on his own 2 feet. The evening air in New York City was crisp and cool as Xavier made his way to Carnegie Hall. The streets were bustling, the city alive with energy. But all Xavier could think about was the moment he would walk on stage. He entered the Grand Concert Hall, a place that had seen the world's most legendary performers grace its stage. As he stood in the wings, waiting for his cue, he couldn't help but take in the beauty of it all: the towering ceilings, the intricate chandeliers, the hushed whispers of anticipation from the audience. When the moment came, Xavier stepped out onto the stage, his heart pounding, but his feet steady. The spotlight hit him as he made his way to the grand piano. The audience's faces were a blur in the dim light, but he could feel the collective gaze upon him. This was it. This was his moment. As his fingers gently touched the keys, the familiar calmness of the music enveloped him. He closed his eyes, and the rest of the world fell away. The performance flowed effortlessly, each note a reflection of his journey, each phrase an expression of his growth. The audience seemed to hold their breath with him, caught in the rhythm of his emotions. The final note lingered in the air as the last piece of music was played. The hall was silent for a moment, a hushed reverence that felt almost sacred. Then, the applause came, rising like a wave, overwhelming and deafening. Xavier opened his eyes, standing to bow, and in that instant, he knew that this was where he was meant to be. The performance was a triumph, and the reviews the next day were glowing. Yet, as Xavier read through the praise and accolades, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about the recognition, it was about the journey. The music had carried him through his darkest days and helped him find the light. And now, standing on the stage of Carnegie Hall, he realized that his journey was only just beginning. He wasn't just playing for the audience anymore. He was playing for himself. Xavier sat in his dressing room backstage at Carnegie Hall, the echo of the audience's applause still ringing in his ears. His hands were trembling from the excitement, his heart still racing from the performance, but beneath it all, there was a deep sense of peace. For the first time in his life, Xavier felt truly at ease with who he was. The doubts that had plagued him for years, the fear that he would always be defined by his last name, that he would never escape the shadow of his father, had faded away in the light of his own accomplishments. The road to this moment had been long and fraught with challenges. There had been moments of self-doubt, moments when he questioned his own worth, moments when the pressure of his family legacy seemed too much to bear. But every step, every performance, every note he played, had led him here. This night was his. It was a celebration of who he was, not as the son of Elon Musk, but as Xavier Musk, a man who had found his own path in life and was brave enough to follow it. As he left the stage, his manager met him with a wide grin. "That was unbelievable, Xavier. Absolutely incredible. You've really made your mark now." Xavier smiled, his exhaustion tempered by the fulfillment he felt. "It didn't feel like I was making a mark," he replied. "It felt like I was just being me." His father, Elon, had come to the performance, sitting quietly in the back, as he often did when supporting Xavier's endeavors. But tonight, something about the way he looked at Xavier, proud, supportive, yet humble, made Xavier feel that he truly had earned his place in this world, not just as his son, but as his own person. Elon had always been a complex figure in Xavier's life, a man of vast achievements, but one whose expectations could sometimes feel overbearing. Yet tonight, Xavier understood something essential: he was not competing with his father. He was simply growing into himself, and Elon recognized that. Backstage, Elon approached him after the performance, his usual guarded expression softening. "You were amazing, son," Elon said, his voice unexpectedly warm. "I knew you had it in you. But tonight, I saw something different. I saw you." Xavier felt a lump in his throat. For so long, he had struggled with the idea of never living up to his father's expectations. But now, there was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition that the legacy Xavier was building was his own, not a reflection of his father's dreams. "Thanks, Dad," Xavier said quietly, the weight of his words reflecting the depth of his journey. "I'm finally starting to figure out who I am, on my own." Elon nodded, his usual intensity replaced by something gentler. "That's the most important thing. The world can be full of expectations, but the only one that matters is the one you place on yourself. You're doing great." As they walked together out of the hall, Xavier felt a profound sense of relief. The world had expected so much from him, but he had learned to let go of those expectations. In doing so, he had uncovered something much more valuable: his own sense of purpose, his own path. In the months that followed, Xavier's career continued to flourish. He performed across the world, but now, he did so with a renewed sense of freedom. The pressure to conform to others' expectations had lifted, and in its place was a deep satisfaction in his own artistry. His music began to evolve, reflecting his personal growth, more complex, more daring, yet always unmistakably his. Xavier also found himself embracing the responsibility of mentorship. He began teaching young musicians who were just starting their journeys, sharing his story with them and offering guidance on how to navigate the complex world of performance, artistry, and identity. He wanted to pass on the lessons he had learned, the importance of finding your own voice, of embracing the inevitable challenges that come with success, and, most importantly, of living authentically. His relationship with his family also deepened. He found a new sense of connection with his mother, Mae Musk, who had always been supportive of him, and with his siblings, who shared in his joy and pride. The Musk family was a force to be reckoned with, but Xavier knew that his place in it wasn't defined by his last name. It was defined by who he had become, someone who had carved out his own niche, in the world of music and in his own heart. Then, one quiet evening, after a particularly moving concert in Paris, Xavier received a letter. It was from the Vienna Philharmonic, one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world. They wanted to collaborate with him on a special concert series that would showcase contemporary composers. It was the kind of invitation that would solidify any artist's place in history. But as he read through the details, Xavier didn't feel the usual sense of fear or excitement. Instead, he felt a deep certainty. This was the next step in his journey. It wasn't about impressing others or proving anything. It was about continuing to share his music with the world and embracing every opportunity to grow. He accepted the invitation without hesitation. As Xavier stood at the piano for his final performance of the year, back in New York, at the same hall that had first introduced him to the world, he realized that the true legacy wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about living a life true to oneself, embracing the beauty of the journey, and sharing that journey with others. In that moment, as the music filled the air and the audience listened in rapt attention, Xavier Musk knew that he had rewritten his legacy. It wasn't a legacy of a famous name or an expectation to live up to. It was a legacy of authenticity, of self-discovery, and of music that spoke to the heart. And that, Xavier mused, was the only legacy that truly mattered. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?